start by really thanking Jason for inviting me to come and speak at your session. And I also always want to just start by thanking you. I know how difficult it can be to give up your very valuable time. So it's always something, a good opportunity to say thank you for coming along to find out a little bit more about how to make learning content and digital content accessible. So a great introduction from Jason to my background. I suppose one of the things for me that I kind of like always pull out on is that I also worked in higher education for about 5 years, and it was really my experience as an instructional designer there that made me realize how little help there was specifically for learning designers, for learning developers and instructional designers on how to make their learning content accessible. And that's really what started me. I decided to kind of specialize and become as much of an expert as I could in what we call accessible learning content. And I suppose probably for about the best part of I suppose 8 or 9 years now, I've really been focused on how to make digital content and e-learning content accessible for people. Things like how to train it, how to make it come alive, how to change people's behavior and perceptions, and really importantly, how to make it stick. So how we take the kind of good intention of making our content accessible, and how do we then weave that into our practice going forward. So what we'll do on the session, I'll start off by just showing you our agenda, so what we're going to be covering. So we're going to start off by setting the scene, and in that section what we'll do is we'll start with a few important definitions, and we'll also maybe address some of the key myths and misconceptions around disability, which often stop people kind of becoming engaged with it in our experience. And what we'll do then is move on to a deeper dive into into a focus around the standards of accessibility. So we're looking specifically here at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the international standards which really give us guidance on how we need to make all of our digital content accessible. We're looking to kind of some of the pros and cons and some of the things that are specifically relevant when we're applying those standards to creating learning content. And then we'll focus on the practical tips, so the taking action section. So I think this is always a really important part of any session that I deliver, because I think, again, it's really important to kind of show some of the practical things that all of us can do. So they are sometimes, very easy things we can do. Sometimes we might need to use a tool to help us to do it, but all of them are very easy to access. So I've specifically focused on things which I think will have a big impact for our learners or for our digital users, and also things which are quite easy for us to implement and to understand. So hopefully you'll be able to take some of those key things away and maybe start straight away thinking about how you can apply them both in your own practice and maybe wider within your organizations as well. And what we'll finish with is just some key takeaways. So hopefully some things that you might be able to take away, and in an ideal world, maybe share with some other people and help spread the word about how important accessible digital and learning content is. So before we move on, I just want to say there's a couple of things just to be aware of when it comes to the kind of how we're going to run this session. And first of all, Jason, just to check with you, I think you have activated the captions in Zoom, so people are able to put those on. I think you're still on mute, Jason, sorry.
There we go. Yes, I have.
Great.
And I suspect everyone would sort of have the option to also see the captions. Yes.
Yeah, so in the toolbar you can yes, in the toolbar in Zoom you can activate the captions. The other thing that we've done, you might be able to notice, I'll show you a slide in a moment, but at the top of the screen you can see that as well as having the captions which are in Zoom, I've also activated the Microsoft translator captions. And the reason that we do that is because actually that translator app that you have within PowerPoint, what it does is it allows you to also have captions, but some people find it useful. You can, if I go to the next slide, you can see, hopefully. So some people find this these captions quite useful because you can activate them on a different screen if you want to, if you find it distracting having captions at the bottom of the screen. And equally, another thing that you can do is you can actually look at them on a mobile device. So some people find that very helpful. We also find that the Microsoft Translator captions tend to be a little bit more accurate than the Zoom captions because they've actually processed the content of our slides before we begin. So they can be a little bit more accurate. And the other thing that you can do in the Microsoft Translator app as well, if you would prefer, that you have options to translate the captions into many different languages. So if you would prefer not to, have them in your own language rather than in English or whatever suits you better, that's another option to be aware of. So as I say, you can see from here, this is the URL, and then you just need to put this little code in, and that will give you the captions and the option to watch them in English or watch them in many other languages. And this is always at the top of the slide as well. So if you lose it for any reason, at every slide you will see that you have the little code there and the URL that you can access. So hopefully that will be useful for everybody as well. Okay, so as I said, what we will begin with at the beginning of this session is just setting the scene. So as I say, starting off with a couple of definitions. And I think Jason touched on this really nicely when he was explaining maybe moving beyond sort of open access and really focusing in this session on accessibility and what accessibility means. So I think it's very common when we use that term accessibility that quite often people, it has different meanings for lots of people. So very often people think maybe when I'm talking about accessibility, I'm talking about something that can be easily obtained or used. And for other people, it might mean it's something that's easy to understand. So of course, it does have those meanings. But for the definition that we're going to use or focus on in this particular session comes from the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. And what they say is that accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with content. And it also means that they can contribute equally without barriers. So the reason I begin with this definition really is just to highlight the fact that accessibility, in the sense that we're talking about it in this session, at its heart is about making sure that people with disabilities have equal access to all of our digital content. And that includes learning, of course. And also, really importantly, that they can contribute equally without barriers. So let's move on now and then just clarify exactly what we mean by people with disabilities. So while many legal definitions of disability traditionally have been based around the medical model, and that's really focused on the idea that disability is caused by impairments that need to be treated or managed or cured. But the definition that I'm about to give you is based on what we call the social model of disability, and it comes from the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And what that definition says is that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So you may have noticed that the social model of disability takes into consideration barriers as well. And I don't know if you noticed in our definition before, we were also thinking about people being able to contribute without barriers. So barriers is a really important word when we're starting to think about accessibility and who it applies to and how it affects us. So I think the idea that external barriers that people create can have a huge impact on the ability of people with disabilities and access needs to participate equally. But I think the important point about these barriers is that most often, particularly when we think about our own practice, they're unwillingly or unknowingly created. So it's not the fact that we are, trying to exclude people. It's just the fact that we maybe don't understand how some of our practices can have the effect that not everybody is able to have an equal either opportunity to access the content or to contribute to the learning experience. So what we'll do now is we'll just touch on a few of these barriers now, but what we'll do is really focus on them in a bit more detail when we come to our practical tips. And I think that really kind of makes it all fit into place, because you can really understand some of the barriers that as I say, we may be creating unintentionally in our own digital content. So I'm sure that everyone who is at the session today would probably agree that removing barriers in our digital content and giving everyone equal access, particularly in our case in a learning experience, to be able to achieve their potential is hugely important. So why is it then that accessibility is something that I think is still, in my experience, relatively sort of unknown, or not, maybe not have as much impact or as much emphasis as we would like in organizations? And I think often that comes down to kind of myths and misconceptions around accessibility and around disability. So what we're going to do now is just look at a couple of very common myths that we hear, and also we'll look into a bit of a few statistics which might be helpful to counteract those myths. So we'll start off with the first accessibility myth. So these are kind of myths that so I've found myself in my own experience, and also in a lot of the work that I've done working with different organizations across different sections. So I would say probably the first, the myth that is probably the most common that I hear working with different organizations and different clients, is that accessibility isn't worth doing because it only benefits a few people. It only benefits a niche audience. So as I say, it's quite useful always, I think, before we dive into the practicality, just to explore some facts and statistics, just to help us find out if this is actually the case. So if you do some research into statistics about disability in different countries, you will probably find a bewildering range of information. And that can be due to the definitions of disability used, or the way that the data is collected or interpreted. So I have a slide here which is kind of the UK slide based on UK a UK accessibility expert who are called Hassel Inclusion. And what they say that it is that in most Western countries, the size of the disabled population ranges from 12% to 26%. And globally, it's recognized to be about 15% of the population. So certainly for me, understanding a little bit more about the statistics around, the prevalence of disability in our population was something that was a key light bulb moment for me. And if I just come to this slide, one of the kind of the best quotes that I found to kind of counteract this argument comes from Neil Milliken, and he's a very well-known accessibility advocate. He at the moment is working in Atos, and he said 1.3 billion disabled people worldwide is not a niche, it's a demographic megatrend. And for me, that's always been a really helpful quote to have up my sleeve if anybody does say that disability is only a niche, and it doesn't have an effect on many people. So another important factor to consider is about the number of people in our organizations. So again, a very, very common comment that we hear is, oh, we don't need to make our digital content or our learning content accessible because we don't have any disabled people in our organization. It could be in our department or in our faculty or etc. So again, I think it's really useful to have a look at some statistics. Again, apologies, they are very UK based, these statistics that I'll be using. But when you think of the if we're thinking about students, so this is the percentage of UK home students that have a disability or are disabled, that is as much as 17% of the student population, as I say, in research that's been done in UK universities. And then moving always over, I think, because we do tend to, when we're thinking about learning content, we do quite often focus on the higher education sector, and we do quite often focus on our student population. But a really important piece of learning when I was working in the university sector was actually how important it is for all of our digital content, whether that is for our student population or it is for our colleagues who might be working in student services or in professional services in HR, finance, just how important it is for all of our digital content across the board to be accessible for everybody. So again, if we look at the percentage, again, it's UK based, but the percentage of the UK workforce that's disabled is about 13%. So again, for me, that's that percentages were I found it very, it was very interesting and kind of impactful for me to realize just how many people I could be excluding from my learning content and my general digital content if I wasn't making it accessible. So a key thing for me. So if that's the case, if there are, if that is a high percentage of people that do have disabilities, why is it that we aren't so aware of it? Why is it that it's very often overlooked? And I think one of the key things really is that according to the global charity Hidden Disabilities, you can see in this slide here that I've used the sunflower background because they have a sunflower symbol. They're an organization that promotes the use of a sunflower symbol to help people show that they have a disability that you can't see. So as I say, a lot of the reason that we're not so aware of disability is because a lot of the disabilities that people experience are hidden. And so that what I'd like you to do now, so as we're going through, I will ask you a couple of times just to kind of have a think. I'm not going to ask you to put anything in the chat, but it's just an opportunity really for reflection and for you to have a think. So what I'd like you to think about now is what percentage of disabilities do you think are actually hidden? So see if you can think, how many of the disabilities, so what percentage do you think are actually hidden? And I think a lot of people then are surprised when the charity, as I say, Hidden Disabilities, what the percentage they've come up with is 80%. Sometimes I've seen 70 as well, but it's still a large proportion of disabilities that are hidden. So I think when many people think about disability, a common perception maybe it refers to people maybe who use a wheelchair or have vision access needs. Quite often we think of people who are blind, but I think an important shift in mindset in understanding just how beneficial accessibility is to so many people is to realize that it applies to a whole range of different access needs. And we're going to explore that a little bit later in the session. So we've just got one more myth to cover before we move on. And that myth says that accessibility is only important for people with visual access needs. So it's really focusing on that, the perception that a lot of people have that when we're talking about making content accessible, we're really thinking about people with vision access needs. So I think a really important, as I say, kind of change in mindset that we'll think about now is just understanding the range of different access needs that we need to be aware of when we're trying to make our digital and our learning content accessible. So again, this is the next slide is an opportunity for you to have a think. So when it comes to digital access needs, what we tend to do is to kind of to make it a little bit more manageable and make sure that we're not forgetting anyone. We try and break it down into 4 particular access needs or 4 categories, and they are vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. Now, obviously, these categories are very artificially neat. People who have access needs and disabilities will very often have more than one access need. So I think it's about 75% of people with disabilities and access needs will have more than one. But for our purposes, it's quite useful just to start kind of, I think, understanding and making it more achievable if we break them down into these 4 categories. So just one thing to point out in these 4 categories is our third icon here, and that is for motor access needs. And you can see I'll just use my little mouse so you can see it. So this is for motor access needs. It's really important just to be aware that when we're talking about motor or mobility access needs in the kind of digital space, what we're talking about is people who have issues interacting with the hardware. So very often they are issues with that mean that people aren't able to use a mouse or to use maybe their fingers on a mobile device. So it's just a really important distinction to be aware of when we're considering what we need to do to make sure that we include people with motor access needs. So the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is just see if you can maybe think of an example of a condition that relates to each one of those different access needs. So see if you can, you don't need to put them in the chat or anything, just just want you to have a think and see if if you can come up with one example of each. Okay, and then I will allow you just a moment to do that.
Just to drop in here, Susie, just for a second, I think whilst everybody's doing that, within the context as well of open education, many of the universities that we work with are open universities. And I think the idea is that when we have open universities or open educational institutions, they tend to be learners who have not necessarily transitioned through the formal education system for whatever reason, because that system didn't quite cater to their needs. And in many of those instances, it has to do with undiagnosed or unrecognized disabilities, which have contributed to them not having progressed sufficiently or successfully through formal education. So I think it's also incumbent on open universities and those institutions which are open in so much as they're capturing those individuals who didn't go through the formal system. It's incumbent on them to specifically look at disability as a core element of their offer and how best to cater to those with disabilities. I just wanted to point that out as an interesting thing for those in the audience who actually are from open universities and open institutions.
Definitely, a great point. Okay, wonderful. So just coming back then to the task that I asked you to do was just to have a think and see if you could think about a condition that might apply to each one of these access needs. So it might be something that you've had experience of, or you know someone who has, or just something that you're aware of. So these are the kind of typical conditions that we are, you know, that people kind of share with us. So from vision, we quite often will have blindness, things like low vision, and then we have color vision deficiency or color blindness, which is something which quite a lot of people maybe overlook and is quite interesting and quite important when we're trying to make our content accessible for a whole range of different vision access needs. And then we quite often get some specific examples, so things like glaucoma or cataracts, for example. From hearing, you might have things like deafness, hearing loss, and then again some examples because of acoustic trauma, auditory processing disorder, tinnitus, for example. From a motor point of view, this idea of not being able to access content using, for example, a mouse or fingers on a mobile device, could be things like limb differences, and then lots of conditions such as arthritis, MS, RSI, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's or tremors. And then the cognitive range, that does include people who have learning disabilities such as Down syndrome. It also includes people who have a range of neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism. Then we have things that are affected by movement and flashing content, things like epilepsy, vestibular disorder, and then a whole range of mental health issues that can also affect cognitive access needs as well, cognitive ability. So I think that's a really good starting point for thinking about, you know, these are the whole range of digital access needs that we need to be aware of, and that we need to make sure that we're including people, to say, with a whole range of access needs in our content. Okay, and I think this question about accessibility only being important for people who have got permanent access needs. So that's another thing that people kind of, you think, okay, accessibility is fundamentally about disability, but I think it is worth being aware that actually it has wider benefits for all of our content, or all of our audience, and that can include what sometimes we look at temporary and situational access needs as well. So again, sometimes it's an opportunity for you to have a think, but I will run through these very quickly. If you can think of anything, a temporary access need is something that any of us could experience at any time. You can see the image on the screen there of someone having a broken wrist. That's affecting their motor ability, their ability to use a mouse. So that's a good one, as I say, for our motor access need. For vision, you could have something like blurred vision due to surgery, hay fever, lost reading glasses, for example. Hearing could be due to, yes, I quite often lose mine, head cold, exposure to loud noise, blocked ears, etc. And very, very common for all of us is to be affected by things like tiredness, stress, and anxiety that can affect our cognitive ability. Situational access needs is similar, but it's about the environment around us. And just some examples of these a little bit more learning focused. You can think about learning environments that could have an impact on people. So you've got an example here. One that we used a lot during lockdown was learning while caring for children while home working, learning on site with sunlight obscuring the screen, or a slow internet that prevents you downloading pictures, learning, for example, on a noisy factory floor. That was one example of an organization that we worked with, learning in a distracting home or study environment. So I think the key thing about the temporary and situational access needs is, although, as I say, the focus on accessibility is thinking about people with permanent access needs, I think it's really a really important point to be aware of, that actually accessibility can benefit everybody. So I'll just move on to this slide as well. So I think another really strong argument for the fact that accessibility brings an improved experience for everyone centers around the fact that designing inclusively helps people not only solve problems using their own biases, but actually leads to a broadening of perspective. And that improves learning and improves content for everything. That's certainly something that we really, really find with our own learning and work with the organizations that we work for. And this is a great quote from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Kit toolkit. You have a link to that in your support notes. And what it says is that everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities, but designing for peoples with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. And for me, that's a kind of a guiding principle when we're looking at the benefits of making our digital content accessible. So what we'll do now is just move into a little bit more detail about the WCAG standards, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions before we move into our practical tips. So I think it is really important to have this focus on the web content accessibility guidelines and why they are so important, and why it's really, they kind of are at the center. They underpin everything that we do when we're looking at trying to make digital content accessible. So again, a UK based slide. It's just looking at why it is that these web content accessibility guidelines are so important. And I think it's quite helpful to look at those, the UK regulations and the laws, because they are quite typical of the type of things that you have in lots of different organizations, in lots of different countries internationally. So in the UK, we have the Equality Act, which is kind of our overarching anti-discrimination law. And it's really interesting that is underpinned by the web content accessibility guidelines when we're looking at digital content. But there is actually no case law in the UK which emphasizes that it's definitely the web content accessibility guidelines that we need to be meeting. However, the law changed in the UK and in Europe in 2018, and that moved into really pointing the way to say that yes, it was the web content accessibility guidelines, and it was a particular version and a particular level that people needed to meet. That is the legal requirement in the public sector, but it also what it did was it pointed that to be the benchmark for what everybody else should be trying to achieve. And as I say, that is quite that's quite common in different countries, to have kind of an overarching and then maybe a little bit more specific legislation around what you need to do to make your digital content accessible. There's a useful, again, a link to it in your support notes, a useful page on the W3C site. It's due to be updated. It's a little bit out of date now, but what it does show is that those web content accessibility guidelines really underpin the majority of international legislation. And if I just come to this again, quite a useful quote from W3C, they say that the web content accessibility guidelines are a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. So there really is a widening movement internationally to be considering those web content accessibility guidelines to be not only the legal requirement, but best practice as to how we make our digital and our learning content accessible to people that include the whole range of different access needs that we were talking about earlier. So if we look at what that means in practical, in practical terms, if we're thinking, okay, that's fine, how am I now going to start applying the web content accessibility guidelines? So if you've never seen the web content accessibility guidelines, and this slide I think is just a good overview, you can see that there are actually at the moment 78. Most legal requirements means that you need to meet A and AAA requirements. So that's 50 guidelines that you need to be aware of. Not all of them are relevant to what we do in learning or digital content, but that is basically what the legal standard says. So as I say, when you start looking at it, you think, goodness, that's quite an achievement, to make sure that I've that I've ticked every single one of those. So what we'll do is just look into a little bit more depth about what it actually means for us. So obviously this is the experience that I've had over a few years myself and working with organizations of some of the things that I think it's really useful to know about those web content accessibility guidelines before we start. So I think one of the key things is just to be aware, if you do have a look at them, again, there's a link to them in your notes, that when you look at them, they are written for people who are developing websites and who are generally people who have coding experience. So sometimes they can be quite technical. Just to give you a good example, this is my favorite one that I always come up with. It's our WCAG standard 1.3.1. And what it says is that information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. Now that's very common for the type of language that's used when you look at those web content accessibility guidelines. So what it actually means, that's quite complex standard, is that when you are developing content, whether that is whatever tool that you're using, we've got two examples here on the screen. One is a Word document, and one is a piece of e-learning that's created using an authoring tool, which is called Articulate Storyline. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that you are applying, for example, heading styles or list styles through the actual tool itself, rather than actually just creating them yourself. So you can see, for example, that these styles here are used in Word, and that we've applied a heading level there. And this is the same type of idea in our Storyline tool. We've applied a heading level here. And I'll explain why that's important in a little bit later on. But it's just to show you that actually trying to translate sometimes the web content accessibility into the practicalities of what we need to do can be quite complex. So it's a good thing to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is sometimes the standards are particularly written for websites. So people who are creating kind of informational, maybe e-commerce websites, might be slightly different to the context that we're doing, particularly when we're focusing on learning content. So a really good example, for example, a really good example is that there are lots of standards around making errors in the web content accessibility guidelines, but these are referring really to a web form that you would be filling in. They wouldn't necessarily be relevant to what we're doing. So that's another thing that we have to do. Sometimes they can be quite subjective, and we need to interpret them for the actual the context that we're doing, in our case learning content. And okay, next thing that sometimes to be aware of is that sometimes we tend to focus on those A and AA standards. So even W3C says that AAA conformance isn't necessarily possible to achieve. And that means that sometimes people kind of forget the AAA guidelines, those kind of advanced ones. In actual fact, for us, particularly if you're thinking about learning content, they can sometimes be very helpful. So for us, a AAA guideline that we always recommend people is to show people in a learning context where they are. It may not be so important in a web page, in a web site, to know where you are. It's not necessarily a process, but learning does tend to be a process. So it can be really helpful to make sure that you let your learners know how they're progressing and where they are. So I say that those are kind of some of the things to be aware of. And the other thing, I think I discussed this with Jason, is that there are some developments around the web content accessibility guidelines. So there's a new version 2.2, which is due to be released soon, and then another version, and they're very vague about this, but in a few more years is due to be released. But I think the interesting thing about that WCAG 3 version is that rather than just being pass or fail standards for a particular site or some learning content, they will allow you to have a gold, silver and bronze, which I think is criteria, which I think is really a great it's a great improvement to just saying, okay, if you've got one thing wrong, you fail. Your whole site or your whole piece of learning content will fail. So just a very quick look at those 2.2 standards. So there's actually 9 more being introduced, and that's at the beginning of this year. They're due to be released. So that's just it gives you an idea of what they will look like. What we focused on in the practical tips, I really wanted to show things that anybody can do. That with just it's that idea. A really important a quote around accessibility is this idea of just not being, it's very difficult. This progress over perfection. It is very difficult to make any content accessible for every single different type of access need, every single type of assistive technology. But any small steps that we can do, we can take, really have a huge impact, I think. So I think the first point really is to be aware that that the examples that I'll be showing in the rest of the practical tips really cover all digital content. So when we talk about learning, and quite often we kind of assume that learning is delivered in a certain way, and what we're all aware of is that there's learning can be delivered in so many different ways. So what I've tried to do is there are some examples which focus on particularly learning, but actually this is everything. All of these principles that we're talking about and all of these practical tips are applicable across all of the digital content. So not just for content that we're creating for our students, but also content that we're creating for our colleagues, because we have no idea of how that accessible content can benefit people. So again, coming back to this idea of being overwhelmed when looking at those web content accessibility guidelines, and you can see this kind of great long list of those guidelines, and certainly my own experience of trying to apply those was quite overwhelming. So a couple of things that I found helpful. One of them is a framework which I developed myself as an instructional designer, and I think there is a link to that again in your support notes. So it's just, for me, I found it easier to change that kind of great long list and try and break them up into topics that almost followed the flow when I was creating my own content. Obviously that will not be the same for everyone, but also I found it quite useful as a framework, because it meant I could I could have a deep dive into, for example, what I needed to know about images or what I needed to know about text. So that was something that I found personally quite helpful, and as I say, there is a link to that framework, I think, in your support notes. The other thing that I think is really helpful when you're getting to grips, when you're first starting with accessibility, is dividing what you're doing into those 4 digital access needs, because what that means is it just becomes a bit more manageable. So and it also means that you're making sure that you're including everybody when you're thinking about how you're going to make your content more accessible. So what I've done in these practical tips is I've split them up into those 4 different access needs and given you a couple of examples of things that you can do for each one. So we're going to start off with vision, and you'll notice for each of the practical tips I give you that generally they are actual requirements of these web content accessibility guidelines. So it's looking at how we're actually applying these guidelines and things that we can do. So one of the ones that I always start off with when we're talking about vision is this importance of color contrast. And that is because in actual fact, there is a report, a WebAIM report, that looks at how many issues are still, they still find on web pages. And in their 2022 report, they identified that a huge 83.9% of home pages worldwide still didn't meet these color contrast requirements for text against background. So it's always one of the ones that I start with, because for me it can have such a huge impact, and it's so easy to apply once you understand what it's all about. So the issue about color contrast is that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines don't tell us which colors we should use. What they tell us is the contrast that we should use between a text and the background to make it easier for people with low vision to see, and that can affect so many people. Also, people who have got color vision deficiency as well. Older people tend to one of the first things that changes with eyesight is your color perception. So it's a really important standard to apply for a lot of different people. So what I'd like you to do now is just again have a think, and if you can see, look at this example on the screen. We've got some four different dots here, and I want you to have a look at the green one, and you've got a green background and then white text on it, and just think for yourself, is it easy for you to see the contrast? Is it easy for you to read that text? Now, that can be very subjective. It can depend on your own eyesight. It can depend on the monitor that you're looking at, etc. So really, the only way we can tell whether that is inaccessible and it's easy for the majority of people to read is to actually rely on what the Web Content Accessibility Guideline tells us. And that tells us that we should have a contrast of at least 4.5 to 1 between the color behind and the text. So again, that's quite helpful, but how do you know that? So this is where the first of our free tools comes in. It's a website that you don't need to download anything. You can just access that website. And all you need to do is enter the color values. They can be the hex values that you have here, or your RGB values. You can find those usually from the tool, the application that you're working in. And what you need to do is just put those into this website, and it will tell you whether you're meeting the requirements or not. So just to show you what that looks like, I've got a little video here, and that just shows all you need to do is put your two color values into those. And in our case, because one of the color values is already white, we don't even have to do more than one. And then you just put that in, and it will tell you whether you are meeting, passing or failing your Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And you can see here the color contrast ratio that we need to meet that guideline is 4.5 to 1. This is only meeting 2.22 to 1. That is why it's failing against the color contrast ratio. So that's a really easy thing that you can do when you are across all of your digital content, whether it's your PowerPoint presentations or your Word documents, or if you're actually using an authoring tool to create content. So really key Web Content Accessibility to start with for a vision. And you can see very often that one of the things that happens is that if you have a lot of organizations will have a brand palette, and the brand palette will have colors in them that together are accessible, but there may be some colors that are not accessible. So you can see an example here, and not at all a criticism, it's just a good example to find, is that sometimes an organization will be using a color combination that actually doesn't meet the requirements. Maybe in this color combination, if there was a black used there, which is another one of the colors, it may be in the brand that would pass the color contrast ratio. So it's really a combination of the colors that we're looking at, and a really useful tool that we use a lot with the organizations we work with. Again, you've got a link for this in your support notes, is what we call this 8 shapes checker, and you can put all of the colors in your brand into this grid, and it will tell you whether they are passing or failing. And for me, it's that really important idea that it's a combination of colors that's important to be aware of. So we have color contrast ratios that are important for text against background. We also have another one which is important for non-text contrast. So for example, things like interactive buttons on a website, or for colors in charts and graphs. That's very often something that we see in learning content. So another example here is similar colors that we had before. Again, they're being used in a color contrast. Sorry, they're being used here in a graph, and we have a slightly different color contrast ratio. And you can see here again why that WebAIM site is quite helpful, because it will tell you this is the field here on that website which tells you if they're meeting the color contrast, and that is 3:1. So again, it's the color contrast between the shape of your bar chart and the contrast behind the color behind it. So that is something that people often fail when we're doing audits on learning content, is the colors in their charts and graphs. So something to be aware of. Another thing about color, which we'll look at quickly, is when we are using color alone. So this is coming back to our color blindness or color vision deficiency. Really, really important, particularly in learning content as well, is sometimes we are conveying color using or conveying meaning using color alone. So you might have to understand the color of a chart to be able to interpret it. So what we use, again, a link for this is again a really easy a web page to look at, is we sometimes apply a colorblind simulator. So it's worth being aware that there are different types of color blindness, and if you apply that simulator, you can see how that chart might look for somebody who has these different types of color blindness. And it's worth being aware, one of the things that I do very often when I'm checking to see whether I'm meeting this requirement is if I apply a grayscale. And if I apply a grayscale, there are some people who do have color blindness who will only see in monochrome, but even if that's not the case, for me, it's a really good and easy way to check whether something is meeting that. And you can see from here, it's very difficult to understand which is which if you apply the grayscale. So some of the things that you can do, you can make sure that you add text to your graph, or another example that you can do, as you can see here, is you can add pattern to graphs. And again, if you then apply the grayscale rule, then you can see how that is then accessible for someone who does have color vision deficiency or who is colorblind. One of the things I always like to point out, if I can, is real world examples. And something that I found out quite recently in an app which is called the Trello. It's a project management tool, is that they have a colorblind friendly mode, and it's great to see that they are applying the pattern example to make sure that their app is accessible as well. So I thought that was a great example. So just a quick question really is, how many people do you think are affected by color blindness or CVD? How important is it? So have a think. Could it be 1 in 20 men, 1 in 400 women, 1 in 15 men and 1 in 300 women, 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women? Right, so you don't need to put anything in the chat, but just have a think. So it is actually 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women. So if you try and put that in perspective of your audience or maybe your organization, just being aware of how many people that actually affects, for me is again a great reminder of how important it is to be considering all different types of vision access needs. Okay, so the next one, just to be aware of from vision access needs, is all about people who use screen readers. And we kind of have an assumption, I think, in accessibility that everybody knows what a screen reader is and kind of understands. So what I've done is I've got a little example of someone who's using a screen reader, and hopefully we've got enough time that I can show you this clip. And I think it puts into perspective what a screen reader is and how that affects what we do. So if we just look at this screen reader example, it's a couple of minutes, I think, and it has sound on it, so you should be able to hear Mark explaining the basics of what a screen reader is.
This is Mark Sutton from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page. Navigation volume. Link, University of California, San Francisco, link, about UCSF, link, search UCSF. And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate. Rating percent, 75%, 70%, 65, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%, link, UCSF Medical Center. So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information That can be displayed through synthetic speech or Braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a Braille display as an input device.
End of navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page.
Heading level 2. Search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1. Make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all a pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page.
Mark Sutton hands on a MacBook Pro image.
So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag.
You are currently on it.
To describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic.
Reader 042116.jpg.
Much less useful.
Okay, so a quick introduction to everybody to screen reader technology. So one of the things I just wanted to point out, first of all, was I hope you may have noticed that Mark was saying that he was jumping from heading level to heading level, and that hopefully will make it understand. Remember when we were talking about the web content accessibility guidelines, and we looked at that quite complicated first one, and we said if you use heading styles, it helps somebody who is using assistive technology. So if we add heading styles, then someone who is using a screen reader not only has the ability to have that read out, but they actually have the ability to navigate that content. So that's a really key reason why screen reader technology is so important. And again, for us to understand why applying heading styles in whatever application we're using, whether it's a Word document or in an authoring tool, is so important for someone who's using assistive technology. And the other key point from there really is Mark was focusing on alternative text. So that is the text that we add to our images, which means that a screen reader has the equivalent experience as somebody who is able to see that image. And again, this can across the board in the applications that we're using, we have the ability now to add alternative text. So again, it can be in a Word document, it can be in a PDF document, you can have alternative text. This is just an example of the alternative text field in a PowerPoint presentation. So really important if you have an important image that adds something to the meaning, to make sure that is explained for people who are using a screen reader. And equally, the other thing that Mark was showing us is that sometimes you have images very often in PowerPoint presentations that might just be there for decoration. You can see this kind of squiggly thing here. That's really important that we hide that from the screen reader. So we mark it as decorative, and then it won't read out, you know, you heard Mark saying the JPEG 3.4.5 or whatever file name we've given that that image, which is only for decoration. So if it's only for decoration, we need to switch it off so that it improves the learner experience. They don't want to be hearing content that, you know, that read out that doesn't add anything to their meaning. That's just extra noise that they have to process, which isn't helpful at all. So those two are the key kind of key requirements around making images accessible. And again, something I always like to point out, sometimes we use ourselves, or you know, in learning as well, people will use social media platforms, and it's just interesting how many social media platforms now give you the ability to add alternative text. So have a look at some of the social platforms that you use if you're adding an image, and see if you can add your alternative text for your image, and that makes your learning, makes your social media content accessible for people, as for everybody as well. So it's a really great tip to take away. And again, something with social media, again, that you might be aware of, this isn't a WCAG standard, but it's something that is good practice, is that when you are creating hashtags, is to use what we call camel case. And I love this picture of this camel, because the hump in the middle of the camel basically represents the capital letter at the end, at the beginning of the second word. So if you are using a screen reader, if someone doesn't use camel case, it will read out all of those words as one long word. But if you use camel case, the screen reader will recognize it and it will be able to announce it as two separate words. So examples here of camel case that could be used, as you can see, public awareness, disaster preparedness, that is camel case. So again, something that you can use in your own social media just to make your all of your content a bit more accessible. Okay, moving on then to hearing. So when it comes to hearing, the important ones from a WCAG stand, and I think you were talking, Jason, earlier about is having captions. The important thing from a captions point of view is that captions, to meet the requirement and to really give people the equivalent experience, there are three things that are really important for captions. One is that they're synchronized to the action. So we don't just provide them a text alternative. It is actually important from the equivalent experience to make sure that those captions are synchronized to the action. The other thing, if possible, is that we make them as accurate as possible. So sometimes if we're using YouTube, you will see that there are automatic captions added to videos. If it's possible, if you have control over going into YouTube, then you can actually go in and you can put punctuation mark and you can correct any mistakes. So really, again, to have an equivalent experience, those captions should be as accurate as they can. And if you do have any videos that have any sound effects, you can see here it says the phone crashes. If there are any sound effects, then also you provide those in the captions as well. So those are the kind of three things that make our captions as accessible as possible. So a kind of a quick one when we look at hearing, because generally it's captions that are the main thing. But equally, Jason, I haven't got a slide of this, but providing a text equivalent of all of the captions. Sometimes captions, because they're synchronized, can be very fast, so difficult for people to process. So if you provide a transcript as well, that can not only be beneficial for people who have got hearing access needs, but also people with cognitive access needs sometimes prefer to look at a text version rather than to actually to look at moving content, for example. So that was a great point that you made there. And again, just live captions. So something to be aware of when we see accessibility all around us. One of the things that we made sure we did at the beginning of this session was to point out that there were captions available in Zoom, and also to activate the Microsoft. If you've got, I think it depends on what version of PowerPoint you're using, but generally that is a free service to have that translator app when you're using PowerPoint. So something that we find very useful. And again, the idea that accessibility is just all around us. You see improvements in accessibility all the time, and this is something that Zoom itself is working on at the moment, is adding the sign language interpretation to the Zoom functionality. So it's something that, you know, it is all around us from a technology point of view, and it's just, I think sometimes we're just not aware of it. So once you learn a bit more about accessibility, I can guarantee that you'll start seeing it wherever you go in all of the applications you use. Okay, moving swiftly now on to motor. When it comes to motor, the most important thing to be aware of is keyboard accessibility. So if I just show you this montage of different images here, this really shows that the whole range of assistive technology that people can use if they have these manual dexterity issues, which means that they don't use a mouse, or they may not use their fingers, as I say, on a mobile device. So there's a whole range of assistive technology that people use to make our content allows people using that assistive technology to use a whole range of assistive technology. What we need to be aware of is to make it keyboard navigable, or, you know, that we use keyboard navigation. And again, if you haven't seen an example of this, I really recommend you to look at a website, maybe your own learning content, and see if you can actually navigate through it without using your mouse. And all you need to do that, put your mouse away and then use tab, which will jump you from one interactive item to the next. Shift and tab will take you back to the previous item. And once you've found the item that you want to activate, you just use enter or spacebar, and that will activate that whatever it is. It might be a link or a button. And you can see here that really important when you're doing that. A lot of that is actually covered by the tool itself that you're using or the application, but to see if it works, maybe to see how accessible for people with motor access needs your own website or your own your platform is to see that it has what we call a visible focus indicator. So the important difference between someone who is using a screen reader who has keyboard navigation, they still will use the keyboard, someone who is using standard keyboard navigation has sight. So they need to be able to see where they are moving in that content. So if you've got a website like this one, which shows good practice, you can see that every interactive item will have this visible focus indicator around it. So something that you can just test. Another thing which is really important for us from a learning point of view is just being aware of time limits. So if it is possible, unless there's a really good learning reason why you need to impose a time limit, it is much better to give people control over the amount of time. If you consider some of those people using different assistive technologies, how long it can take them to access, or to complete an assessment or to do a quiz question, then I think it's really that really makes the case of why it's really important that people are allowed to control the time or to not imply time limits. Okay, so looking at a few tips on cognitive. First of all is plain language, really important for all of our digital content. There are just 2 links in your support notes to useful readability checkers that we use. One is called the Hemingway app, and you can see that here. And there's also the WebFX app. So those are both ones that we find very helpful when we are creating content. Obviously for us it's English language content, but the content, what those 2 readability checkers do is kind of help you if you are the Hemingway one is very helpful if you are writing your own content, because it gives you tips on how to make your content more accessible. If you, for example, you've got a very hard sentence, to break it down. We find this one, the WebFX one, really helpful if we're working with subject matter experts, maybe a sort of university professors who might be giving us quite hard, very high level language. It's a useful one just to show, because it has a range of different readability indices. It's something that we can just show to say, is it possible, for example, if we work with them, to make the language a little bit more straightforward. So that's a really useful one. And then the cognitive one that I often talk about is when it comes to your presentations. If you do a lot of presentations, then actually making sure that you're using the titling of the slide. If you can, someone who's got cognitive access needs, in fact anybody, can look at the outline of your presentation if you use those titles, and it's really a great way to kind of anchor, understand the process of what they're going to be cover. Okay, and let me just move on to our key takeaway. So really the key takeaway is this idea that these are just some practical tips that I've, that the things that I started myself when I tried to make my digital content accessible. And I think it's a good starting point to understand the implications of maybe what we need to be considering, in the wider, maybe within our organization or within the platforms that we're using. But I think if without that kind of like, oh, here's some practical things that we can do, it can sometimes again feel very overwhelming. So one of the things that I really recommend you to do is to maybe get a bit more familiar with using your accessibility checkers. You can find those in lots of Microsoft applications, and they quite often have links which will tell you more about accessibility and why you're doing things, which I think is really helpful. Other tools that you have, for example, in Acrobat, there's also an accessibility checker in some of the versions of Acrobat, which is for PDFs, which is quite helpful. And then there's just a couple of resources, again, links that are in your content. This one is a tip, 5 tips for all of those different access needs that you can start looking at, and also a useful website that we've put together, which is specifically looking at authoring tools and how you can apply those to the web content accessibility guidelines to different authoring tools. So the one accessibility tip that you've learned today that you'll commit to taking action on and sharing, I think that's probably my last slide, and something for you to consider and take away.